The reception tent at RAF Fairford buzzed with the controlled energy of military ceremony. My mother stood beside a decorated group captain, her hand gripping his sleeve like he was a life raft. Her voice pitched high with rehearsed pride as my half-brother Christopher shouldered past two senior officers, thrusting his soft hand toward pilots for photographs. He wore an RAF lapel pin bought online for less than a tenner. She squeezed the group captain's arm tighter. "This is Christopher, my son. He's an aerospace defense consultant with Pentagon connections." Then she turned, found me standing 10 feet back at the metal barriers, and waved her hand dismissively. "That's Alice. She types on computers for the military, schedules flights for the real pilots." A girl in uniform, though what use that is, I haven't the foggiest. The group captain's entire body went rigid. He pulled his arm free from my mother's grip, so sharply she stumbled backward. His eyes locked directly onto me. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking with barely suppressed emotion. "Did you just tell me that Wing Commander Alice Hartley, the pilot who shot down 2 enemy fighters over Syria, is a typist?" My mother's laugh came out brittle and high. He continued without waiting for her response. "She's the demonstration pilot for today's show. In 40 minutes, she flies an F-35 over 80,000 people, including you." The champagne glass slipped from my mother's fingers. Crystal exploded against the concrete. "Before we go any further, I want to know where you're watching from right now, and what time it is where you are. Pause for a second and tell me in the comments." All right, let's get into this story. The sound of that glass breaking carried me 30 years backward to a different kind of concrete. Cracked, weeds breaking through, baking under the Yorkshire sun. I grew up in the village of York, where my father James Thornton flew an old crop duster across endless wheat fields from dawn until his hands shook with exhaustion at dusk. The plane was painted faded yellow, a workhorse named the AT-502. He sprayed soybean fields and wheat patches for farmers who paid him in cash and handshakes. To me, that rattling cockpit was the safest place on earth. To my mother, it was proof she had married beneath her. Every night at dinner, she stared at his cracked, stained fingernails and curled her lip. "James," she would say, sneering, "when will you ever get a real job? Spraying pesticides makes you nothing more than a gardener with a pilot's license." He never answered. He just drank his water and stayed silent. That contempt became the oxygen I breathed. When I was 13, my father finally let me grip the dual controls. The vibration of the engine surged up through the stick, rattled through my thin arms, and settled deep into my chest. Below us, the golden wheat fields blurred into a single amber river. The horizon tilted, the ground fell away, and I felt completely free for the first time in my life. My dad turned his head, eyes shining beneath his leather flying goggles, and spoke over the engine roar. "The sky doesn't care who you are, Alice. Doesn't care if you're rich or poor, boy or girl. Up there, the only thing that matters is whether you know how to fly. The sky is the fairest place on earth." He paused, "but it demands a price." When I was 15, the chemicals he'd inhaled in that unsealed cockpit caught up with him. The doctors found tumors in both lungs. He fought the cancer for 18 months, shrinking and graying through rounds of chemotherapy at the NHS hospital, while still dragging himself to the airfield on better days, refusing to surrender. When I was 17, on one of those days, he stood on the cracked runway and watched me take the crop duster up alone for the very first time. I landed hard, bounced twice, taxied back crooked. He said nothing. He just stood there, shielding his hollowed eyes from the sun, and smiled. 3 weeks later, he died quietly in a sterile hospital bed. My mother refused to attend the funeral. "The paperwork absolves me of any obligation to a man who reeked of pesticide," she told me over the phone. I was 17 years old. I signed the hospital forms with a shaking hand. I sold his faded yellow plane to salvage dealers in Leeds to pay off the crushing medical debt. I stood on that empty runway as strangers hitched his plane to a trailer and towed it away. The propeller spun one last time in the wind. I made a silent vow. I would fly again. 2 years later, I earned a highly competitive RAF scholarship. I brought the acceptance letter home, hoping for just one moment of maternal pride. My mother pinched her nose the moment I walked through the door. She recoiled from the paper, as if it carried the stench of my father's cockpit. "You reek of airplanes," she snapped. "A girl obsessed with flying? No one will ever want to marry you." I packed my dreams into a flight bag and made myself invisible. I graduated at the absolute top of my pilot training class. The selection board didn't see a crop duster's daughter. They saw reaction times and spatial awareness. I was immediately assigned to the most grueling elite track the RAF offered. The F-35 Lightning, in the squadron-ready room, when they discovered I'd learned to fly over Yorkshire wheat fields in a beaten-up crop duster. My call sign was born immediately Dusty. My instructor, a two-tour veteran named Wing Commander Helen Mitchell, slapped the patch onto my flight suit and grinned. But I was living two entirely separate lives. In the air, I was an apex predator. On the ground, to my own blood, I was just a typist. 3 years into my service, deep over hostile Syrian skies, my squadron protected an American logistics convoy moving through open desert near Al-Hasaka province. Radar painted 2 enemy fighters vectoring in fast from the north. Command ordered us to hold defensive position. I saw the geometry. Those jets would reach the convoy in less than 90 seconds. I ignored the retreat order, slammed the throttle past detent, and locked both targets. The dogfight lasted 38 seconds. Both enemy jets came apart in midair. 200 soldiers kept breathing because I refused to turn away. The RAF pinned the silver star on my chest in a closed-door ceremony. I never told my family it happened. Months later, at my mother's Thanksgiving dinner table, my aunt leaned forward. "Lillian, how is that little desk job in the military?" I stared at my hands, the same hands that had squeezed the weapons release trigger to end 2 lives. Last week was exhausting scheduling flights. I lied smoothly. My mother nodded in deep satisfaction. Her carefully constructed worldview remained intact. My fabricated mediocrity posed no threat to her. The cost of my silence was financial. Over the years, my combat pay, deployment bonuses, and flight incentive allowances were bled dry by a family that believed I earned a clerk's salary. Christopher had launched something called Apex Aero Strategies. No clients, no contracts, no expertise. Just glossy business cards and leased office space he couldn't afford. My mother bankrolled his entire fantasy with my money. Sitting in the transient barracks at RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus after a classified briefing, my phone vibrated. Another text from my mother. Another demand. I opened my banking app and wired £12,000 of deployment savings directly into her account without hesitation. By my count, I had transferred over £250,000 across 12 years. A secret financial pipeline from the stratosphere, straight down to earth, funding the very illusion that erased my existence. The true test of loyalty comes when there is no one coming to save you. Deep over Syrian airspace, a Chinook carrying wounded soldiers was shot out of the sky by ground fire. Flight Sergeant Marcus Webb survived the violent crash, but his legs were trapped beneath collapsed metal. Through the emergency frequency, I could hear him breathing short, ragged, desperate. Militia forces were closing in fast. Less than a mile out, my fuel gauge was already dipping into the caution range. Standard procedure meant immediate return to base. If I stayed, I would crash in enemy territory. If I left, Marcus would be captured or killed. I didn't turn back. I banked hard left, dropped below the clouds, and dove straight toward the desert floor. Through my targeting pod, I could see militia vehicles kicking up dust trails, converging from 3 directions. Small arms fire pinged off the wreckage. Marcus's voice came through broken and desperate. "Dusty, they're close, 200 meters. I can hear their engines." I didn't drop ordnance. I used the terrifying acoustic violence of a 100 million pound stealth fighter as a weapon. I flew low, dangerously low, skimming the sand at 300 knots, creating a deafening wall of sound over Marcus's shattered helicopter. Every time the militia tried to advance, I angled my thrusters and roared directly overhead, physically pushing them back with engine wash that flattened their vehicles and kicked sand into their eyes. On my 3rd pass, trace rounds arsed up from the ground, bright green lines cutting across my canopy. I dropped lower. I circled that smoking wreckage for 43 agonizing minutes. Inside my cockpit, the master caution alarm screamed. The fuel gauge needle dropped past the red line. I stayed on station until the rescue helicopters thundered in and extracted Marcus. Only then did I point my nose toward home and climb. I landed running on absolute fumes. As the jet rolled to a stop, the engine coughed, sputtered, and died before I even reached the parking area. The ground crew chief stared at the telemetry. "Your internal tanks are reading 0.0, Major," he said, shaking his head. "You landed on vapor." I unclipped my oxygen mask. My face was soaked in cold sweat. "Marcus needed those 3 minutes more than I did," I replied. That flight earned me the Distinguished Flying Cross. 2 weeks later, I was back in York on mandatory leave. My shoulders still bore bruises from the ejection seat harness. The flight surgeon had grounded me because my cortisol levels were dangerously elevated. Christopher was pacing the living room in a tailored suit, rehearsing a fabricated pitch for investors. He tossed around buzzwords like disruptive paradigm in air superiority and casually referred to Air Commodore Sarah Pembroke, my actual commanding officer, as if they were university mates. My mother watched him pace with absolute adoration, her eyes glowing with a pride she had never once directed at me. She turned and pointed her fork directly at me. "See that, Alice? Your brother is having meetings with Air Commodore Pembroke while you just schedule flights." I picked up a forkful of potatoes and remained absolutely silent. 3 months before the air show, my phone vibrated at midnight. My mother. She didn't ask how I was. She screamed, "Alice, transfer £20,000 to me right now. Don't ask questions. A daughter who is stingy with her mother will find no one to care for her when she is old." My jaw tightened. I opened the banking app and transferred the funds without protest. "Yes, Mum," I whispered. A week later, a promotional VIP package arrived at my mother's house, a heavy blue envelope embossed with a silver eagle crest. Inside was a formal invitation naming me as the solo headliner demonstration pilot for the Air and Space Expo at RAF Fairford. Out of every fighter pilot in the entire Royal Air Force, I had been chosen. When I visited home, I found the invitation in the kitchen trash can, shoved beneath a grease-stained pizza box and used paper towels. I reached into the garbage and pulled out the silver embossed card, wiping tomato sauce off my call sign with my thumb. My mother walked into the kitchen, sipping tea from a porcelain cup. She glanced at the stained paper and scoffed. "Just junk mail. Who would invite a scheduling clerk to perform? Do you want people to laugh at your face, Alice?" My call sign. The title I had purchased with 2,800 hours of flying time, lying in a pile of rotting food. That same afternoon, Christopher burst through the front door, red-faced with excitement, waving his phone. He had scored 4 VIP corporate networking tickets to the exact same air show through a defense industry mailing list. His master plan was to sneak into the pre-flight meet and greet, snap photos with real pilots, and distribute his fake Apex Aero business cards. My mother clapped her hands and spun toward me, snapping her fingers. "Alice, you're driving us to Gloucestershire. You can carry the luggage and fetch our water while we do some important networking." I didn't argue. I folded the greasy tomato-stained invitation in half, slid it deep into my combat boot, and pulled out my secure military phone. The time for taking hits was over. I dialed a secure line to Wing Commander Helen Mitchell, the commanding officer in charge of all aerial displays at the upcoming expo. "I need you to intercept my mother and brother's VIP registration and manually upgrade them to the absolute front row of the pre-flight meet and greet," I said, directly on the center line of the main runway. Priya paused. "Do you want them to see you take off, Dusty?" "I want them to look up at the sky and realize the thing they threw in the trash is flying directly over their heads." "Copy that," she replied simply. The morning of the air show arrived with the smell of heated tarmac and jet exhaust. I wore faded jeans, a wrinkled grey t-shirt, and a cheap baseball cap pulled low over my eyes. I walked 3 steps behind my family like hired help, my heavy pack digging into my shoulders. My mother marched ahead in a cream-coloured dress and clicking designer heels, rehearsing the names of commanders she planned to charm. Christopher strutted beside her in his sharp suit, gripping a leather briefcase stuffed with 200 fake business cards. Sophie, his wife, walked silently in the rear, pulling the heaviest rolling suitcase. As we approached the flight line, my mother stopped dead. "When we get inside, you stand in the back," she ordered. "Don't tell anyone you're military. If people ask, say you're Christopher's assistant, a girl in logistics who hasn't amounted to anything. Talking about it makes me ashamed." I tightened my grip on the backpack straps and nodded once, slow and deliberate, accepting the insult the way a pilot accepts target coordinates before a strike. We walked through the security checkpoints toward the gleaming reception tents. The crew chief at the nearest fighter jet recognized my face and quietly spoke into his radio. I glanced up at the Union Jack, snapping violently in the hot wind. I pressed 2 fingers against my wrist, 56 beats per minute, steady, cold. The exact biometric state I entered right before my thumb depressed the weapon's release trigger, The backpack felt impossibly heavy on my shoulders. The champagne glass shattered against the concrete, leaving a ringing silence that lasted exactly 2 seconds. Every head in the reception area turned toward the sound. Crystal lay scattered across the polished floor, champagne pooling around my mother's designer heels. Then the restricted doors flew open with a heavy metallic bang that made the entire crowd flinch. Flight Sergeant Marcus Webb charged out of the flight line area. He was not walking. He was marching with desperate urgency, his combat boots hammering the pavement like gunshots. His uniform was immaculate, his chest heavy with service ribbons and combat decorations. He stopped dead when he saw me standing there in faded jeans and a baseball cap, holding my mother's designer bags. Tears welled instantly in his hardened eyes. He pushed past a startled senior officer and turned his massive frame directly toward my horrified mother. His voice cracked with raw, uncontainable emotion. "Ma'am, do you know what your daughter did? She flew in circles over my head for 43 minutes when I was about to die in the desert. She landed on vapor. She would have died to save me." My mother's jaw began to tremble. The arrogant posture she had maintained for decades dissolved in front of 80 witnesses. Her expensive sunglasses slid down her sweaty nose. Grant stood paralyzed beside her, his knuckles white around his leather briefcase. Every pilot in the reception area had stopped talking. Every pair of eyes was locked on us. I didn't look at them. I didn't owe them explanation. I shifted my gaze to Marcus, and my posture transformed in a single breath. My spine straightened. My chin lifted. I dropped into my command tone, cold enough to cut glass. "At ease, Flight Sergeant. Glad to see you're still flying." Marcus snapped a textbook salute, the silver aviation wings on his chest gleaming in the harsh Maryland sun. "I'm still flying because of you, Dusty," he declared loud enough for the entire reception area to hear. "My wings belong to you." My mother let out a choked, suffocating sound, a pathetic gasp like a fish pulled from water. I hoisted the heavy backpack containing my flight gear over my shoulder, walked right past her extended hand, past Christopher's frozen face, and headed straight toward the heavy steel doors of the restricted flight line access. A young security forces airman at the door recognized me, snapped to attention, and swiped his badge without a word. Behind me, the sharp click of my mother's designer heels froze dead on the concrete. She did not chase me. Those expensive shoes could not step across the threshold into the brutal arena where only real wings could carry you. I pushed the steel doors open, stepped through into the roar of jet engines, and let them close behind me, leaving my family standing in the ruins of their own making. 80,000 people packed the sun-baked grandstands, a sea of British flags, baseball caps, and camera phones. Down in the dead center of the VIP viewing pavilion, my family sat rigidly in premium leather seats. They gripped fresh glasses of champagne. Their faces were pale. Then the massive loudspeakers boomed across miles of tarmac. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Royal Air Force proudly presents the F-35A Lightning Tactical Demonstration. Your demonstration pilot today, Wing Commander Alice Dusty Hartley, recipient of the Silver Star and the Distinguished Flying Cross. Wing Commander Hartley is one of the most decorated female pilots in the history of the Royal Air Force." My mother's hands gave out completely. Her second glass of the day slipped from her fingers and shattered against the concrete. At the far end of the runway, the grey stealth-coated beast sat idling, shimmering behind waves of heat. The camera zoomed straight into the cockpit. My face framed tightly by my white flight helmet and dark visor filled the massive digital display screens for all 80,000 people to see. The canopy sealed shut with a mechanical hiss. I wrapped my gloved fingers around the throttle and shoved it all the way to the firewall. The Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine answered with 43,000 pounds of thrust, sending a physical shockwave rippling across the grass. The jet launched down the runway, nose gear lifted at 160 knots, and I immediately hauled the stick back into a punishing, unrestricted vertical climb. The airframe shuddered, the altimeter spun. I tore the sky apart with the brutal roar of maximum afterburner. The acoustic shockwave rolled across the airfield like thunder. The crowd erupted into absolute hysteria, screaming, waving flags. In the VIP pavilion, my mother sat perfectly still, physically pinned to her leather seat, forced to watch the daughter she had called a typist bend the laws of physics above her head. For the next 20 minutes, I did not just fly. I executed a flawless, violent ballet of dominance. I pulled agonizing 9G turns that compressed my spine and squeezed the blood from my brain. I flew fully inverted at 200 feet off the deck, tearing down the shoreline close enough to see the blur of 80,000 faces. I pulled the jet straight vertical until the airspeed bled to nothing, let the 35-ton machine stall, then plunged nose down for 3,000 feet before violently lighting the afterburner and pulling out of the dive so hard the jet squeezed my legs like a vice. I unleashed every ounce of raw instinctive airmanship that my father's dusty Yorkshire wheat fields had ever taught me. Down below, Christopher sat ashen-faced and drenched in sweat, soaking through his cheap suit jacket. The leather briefcase of fake business cards sat forgotten on his lap. Not a single commander, not a single defense contractor in that tent wanted to speak to him. Every eye was glued to the sky. The demonstration flight ended. I taxied back to the staging area. The canopy hummed open, letting in stifling heat and the distant roar of the crowd still on its feet. The moment my boots hit the tarmac, spectators swarmed the perimeter fence. Air Commodore Sarah Pembroke, the real Sandra, my actual commanding officer, marched straight up the crew ladder and grabbed both of my hands with deep reverence. A swarm of media cameras pushed forward. A breathless reporter shoved a microphone directly into my face, shouting over the engine wind. "Wing Commander Hartley, where did you learn to fly like that?" I stared dead into the black lens of the live broadcast camera, knowing it was feeding to the giant display screens towering above the grandstands. "In a crop duster plane over the wheat fields in Yorkshire," I said. My father, James Thornton, was a crop duster. He said, "The sky doesn't care who you are." He was right, and today I fly for him. On the massive screens, 80,000 people roared. In the VIP seats, my mother buried her face deep into her trembling hands once the media frenzy died down. I retreated to the shadows behind the hangars. I leaned my exhausted body against the cool metal of the F-35's landing gear. Wing Commander Helen Mitchell followed me. She crossed her arms and leaned against the hangar wall, her jaw set. "For 17 years, Alice," she said, her voice dripping with frustration. "Why do you keep parking your plane in a dark hangar just so your family can comfortably sell tickets to the air show?" The words hit me like a fist to the sternum. She was right. I had not been sacrificing to protect my mother. I had been participating in my own destruction. That night, sitting alone in my hotel room, bathed only in the harsh blue light of my laptop screen, I opened my email and began drafting a message to my mother and Christopher. I did not soften the language. I did not apologize. "Starting today, I am terminating all financial support. All transfers will cease permanently. This is not a punishment. This is a correction. I will no longer clip my wings and stuff them into a dark hangar so this family can comfortably sell empty air." I attached my full unclassified military service record, every medal citation, every combat flight hour, every official commendation. I read it once. I hit send, the financial pipeline detonated. The collapse was swift and merciless. Within 2 weeks, Christopher's fake Apex Aero strategies was blacklisted across every defense contractor network in the country. A program manager called him back. Christopher put it on speakerphone, grinning. The voice on the line was deadpan. "Mr. Ashton, we ran your credentials. No one with your name has ever held a defense and security vetting clearance, and your company is flagged as fraudulent. Do not contact this office again." The line went dead. A week later, Christopher showed up at a defense industry mixer in London, wearing his Amazon lapel pin. He extended his hand to a retired RAF wing commander near the bar. The commander looked at the pin, looked at Christopher's soft, uncalloused hands, and laughed in his face. "You're the brother, aren't you?" he said loud enough for the entire table to hear. "The typist's brother." Christopher left the event without finishing his drink, without my hazard pay flooding her accounts. My mother's personal credit debt exploded. Collection agencies began calling the house at all hours. Cornered and furious, she dialed my number. She did not apologize. Instead, she weaponized the one thing she believed could still break me: the memory of my dead father. "You destroyed this family over an airplane show," she shrieked through the receiver. "Your father, if he were alive, would be ashamed of this arrogance. He flew low his whole life, humbled, never showing off." I let my voice drop into the freezing cold of 50,000 feet. Dad flew low because he had to. But he never hated himself. You did. You spent 17 years locking me in a dark hangar and calling it love. If you want to bring up Dad, Fly straight up to the sky and tell him one real thing you have ever done yourself. I pressed the red button. The line went dead. 3 days later, Sophie called. She was crying hysterically. "Lily, please," she sobbed. "Nobody will work with Christopher. The bank is threatening to foreclose on the house, and he's taking it all out on me. Please fix this." I listened to every word. "There is nothing to extinguish," I replied, my voice flat and final. "Only those who fly on smoke are afraid of the wind." I hung up and blocked the number. 6 weeks of absolute silence passed. Then my phone vibrated with a single message containing an address I hadn't seen in decades. "Please meet me at your dad's old tin hangar in York. I need you." It was the very building she had spent her entire marriage despising. I drove out to the dirt runway alone. The wheat field stretched flat and gold to the horizon on both sides of the cracked road. When I pushed the squeaky metal door open, the smell of old machine oil hit me instantly, thick and familiar, like a hand reaching out from decades ago. I found my mother kneeling on the oil-stained concrete floor before my father's old metal toolbox. Her face was streaked with tears. Her hair was unwashed. Her expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a plain cotton shirt. Her trembling hands held a thick, cracked leather book. She held it out to me without a word. It was my father's pilot logbook. The cover was split along the spine, held together by a strip of duct tape that had gone grey with age. The pages had yellowed and gone brittle at the edges. Some were stained with coffee rings. Others had small sketches of wind patterns drawn in pencil. I flipped past the columns of fuel records and engine hours, all the way to the very last page, dated just 3 weeks before the lung cancer finally silenced his engine for good. It was not a record of flight data. It was a handwritten note, the ink shaky but deliberate, pressed deep into the paper by a dying man's hand. I read the words out loud and my voice cracked on every line. Today Alice flew solo for the first time. 17 years old. She took off without looking down. She doesn't need me anymore. She never did. She was born a pilot. I am just the guy who showed her the sky. At the bottom, underlined twice, he had written 2 words. My wings. My mother looked up at me from the concrete floor, her eyes swollen and utterly defeated. The vanity was gone. The expensive mask she had worn for 32 years had crumbled to dust. "Alice," she whispered, her voice breaking apart, "why did you let me clip your wings that much?" I looked around the rusty tin walls. I breathed in the dust and the oil and the ghost of my father's engine. "I thought if I flew low, you wouldn't have to look up," I said softly. "I self-amputated my wings and called it love. I was wrong. Love isn't flying low to make someone else comfortable." For the first time in her life, my mother did not argue. She did not deflect. She just wept, pressing her forehead against the cold metal toolbox of the man she had wronged for so long. 1 month later, we gathered for breakfast inside that very hangar. Christopher had driven out the week before and painted the rusted metal door with dark blue. The job was sloppy. Drips ran down the corrugated iron like tears, but the door was open. The interior had been swept clean, nailed directly onto the corrugated tin wall. Right next to my father's cracked leather flying goggles hung my silver star and my distinguished flying cross. The open logbook sat on a small wooden table beneath them, displaying the words "My wings to the world." There was no champagne, no crystal glasses, no catered food. Just a dented aluminum pot of bitter black crop duster coffee and a plate of burnt toast. My mother stood up from her folding chair, gripping the edge of the table with both hands to steady herself. Tears ran freely down her bare face. "This is my daughter," she said, her voice raw and unsteady. "She is a wing commander in the Royal Air Force." I looked at the medals on the wall. I ran my calloused hand slowly over the cold, rough tin. I could feel the vibration of my father's old engine somewhere deep inside the metal, somewhere deep inside my chest. "Dad," I whispered to the empty air above the wheat fields. I flew, and this time, someone is looking. If you are constantly making yourself smaller, just to fit into spaces built by people who refuse to grow, it is time to stop. Hit the like button and subscribe to Honor Stories Official if this story empowered you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to stop flying low just to make someone else comfortable?